we're going to be telling you about a study we've conducted exploring if there is potential to embed psychosocial well-being impact across global challenges research where the primary aims are not mental health related. We're using the case study of the UK Global Challenges Research Fund, the GCRF. To date, over 1,200 grants have been awarded. Of these GCRF grants, we selected 36 which did not have as their main aim mental health impact. We selected these 36 for diversity across Research Council, across the GCRF Strategic Challenge portfolios, which relate to the Sustainable Development Goals, and across the different regions of the world using the World Health Organization categorization. And these 36 non-mental health GCRF projects were coded independently by 2 researchers from a team of 14.
Right, so the first research question is really to look at how the GCRF projects sort of self-categorize or identify themselves as engaging with mental health. Really, like, this information is important to establish the relevant context because, the GCRF projects address challenges mainly faced by developing countries. So we need to see what is the investment, the engagement, and the interest in sort of positioning mental health in these researches. And then we move on to really looking more in depth at the potential of these GCRF projects, which are essentially non-mental health projects, to engage with psychosocial well-being impacts. And, most interestingly, perhaps, to look at the opportunities to impact psychosocial well-being within the target groups of these research projects, with only some very minor changes made to the project. So within psychosocial well-being, there are 3 domains that we're focusing on. The first one is promotion of a positive sense of self, like positive self-esteem, self-acceptance, self-expression. The second one looks at promotion of positive emotions, emotion regulation, coping strategies, and even help seeking. And finally, we examine facilitation of skill development, such as life skills, relationship skills, parenting, or healthy lifestyle skills.
There are 3 aspects of the social part of psychosocial well-being. The first one is to facilitate community building. And this would include facilitating social support, mutual engagement, group belonging. Secondly, to preserve socio-cultural identity, identities such as religious identity, ethnic identity, cultural identity, on all aspects of heritage. And third, support community mobilisation. And that would include awareness raising, socio-economic empowerment, reduction of stigma, reduction of discrimination, and reduction of social exclusion. So, what did we find? In total, only 3% of GCRF grants were classified by applicants at submission as mental health related, and virtually all of these were via the Medical Research Council, 27 of them. However, according to our coders, between 50 and 70% of non-mental health GCRF projects already engage implicitly, but non-strategically, with psychosocial well-being impact.
So let's look at the scorecard for potential psychosocial impacts across these research projects. What seemed clear was that the first 2 most prominent impacts were related to social well-being or social capital. And then we had the cluster of 3 psychological well-being opportunities. And last on the list was sociocultural identity as an impact within research. Now, we can clearly see that social capital or social well being is most prominent, and we need to look at some of the caveats why this might have been so. One is that in this project, one was working with summary information, not a very clear understanding of all the complexities of these interesting research projects. Secondly, within the GCRF research projects, the mandate is to work uh, within low and middle income countries, network, collaborate. So it's possibly a reason why the social well being impacts were far more prominent. This does not, of course, in any way imply that psychological well being impacts are not seen across these projects or there are no opportunities available. Perhaps these are hidden, these are impacts that one needs to focus on more. Uh, these are impacts that might be piggybacking on the social well being impacts, and we are not able to see them independently. So perhaps these are all questions for us to think about and develop on in the future.
We now present two short case studies in order to contextualise our quantitative findings in the context of actual grants that we studied. And we also used the notes taken by our coders when looking at the information about these grants. And we were also in the really fortunate position to have an interview with each of the PIs. The first case is titled Levelling the Playing Field, Assessing Through Equity the Quality of Chilean Schools. And the fellow in this project is Bernadita Manoz Shero. And Bernie was at the University of Bristol when she undertook this GCRF fellowship. The fellowship was funded by the ESRC, that's the Economic and Social Research Council. It sits within the GCRF strategic portfolio of education, and of course the world region is the Americas. Our coders agreed that this project showed potential for making full psychosocial impact, and that there was potential for embedding all three of the psychological impacts and all three of the social impacts. So let me tell you a little bit about this amazing study. When I spoke with Bernie about her work, I was really impressed with the way that Bernie's work was attempting to persuade policymakers in Chile to consider the value added of schools who are working with very deprived communities, to reduce vulnerability and to reduce social exclusion, and the impact of the idea that the school is failing when actually the community is highly deprived. When I interviewed Bernie, she reflected also on more potential beneficiaries, saying, and I quote, "Because most of the schools that are described and categorised as failures, usually head teachers in the whole community, they experience a lot of mental health issues." So although it's recognised that the main impact of this study is on policymakers and policy, there are secondary benefits which may have gone unreported in the study.
So the second case study we're going to talk about is about building resilience and inclusion in sub-Saharan Africa through social learning around climate change. This project's principal investigator was Dominic Niverton from University of Sussex. The research council was the Natural Environment Research Council, and the GCRF challenge portfolio that was focused on was environmental shocks and change. And of course, this is situated within Africa. Now, within this project, it looked at the vulnerability of rural communities, mainly herding tribes, to climate related stressors, because these are tribes that are very dependent on agriculture, livestock, and the availability of grazing lands. The target groups of this project, which could be the focus perhaps of the psychosocial well being impacts, were identified by our coders as the vulnerable communities of the project case studies. So within the project, there was a cluster of impacts all within the domain of social well-being. The first was community well-being, followed by socio-cultural identity and community mobilization. The psychological impacts were not easily identified as opportunities within this particular project. So the PI of this project took part in an interview, and he was really open, so reflective on some of the impacts that were possible perhaps in this project. Uh, in this project, there was a lot of close work with the needs of the community. But in this process, the PI became aware of some of the barriers to accessing the gifts of this project, so to speak, among certain vulnerable members of the community. And he shared that the women led households were perhaps the most vulnerable and at the bottom of the hierarchy. So, even with information about weather forecasts, about protection against climate change, even with this, they did not have access to some of the resources that they needed. And I think, in a very sensitive sort of way, the PI spoke about that, and I quote that, so knowing what the seasonal forecast was going to be actually was depressing, for these women. So I sometimes wonder that I might not even be aware of some of the impacts I have on people. I think that's a very powerful sort of sharing, and it really illustrates uh, the almost in your grasp opportunities for mental health impacts across so many research projects. And there's clear evidence for policymakers, for global challenge research funders, and for researchers themselves that there are low hanging fruit opportunities across a range of research projects.
What are the ways forward from here? Well, we can take inspiration from the Lancet Commission on Global Mental Health and Sustainable Development, which was published in 2018. One recommendation is an integration of global mental health within other development priorities, for example, climate change and food security. What our study has shown is, in terms of global challenges research, which tackles the vast array of global challenges and across the Sustainable Development Goals, there is optimism that we can embed mental health impact within those research projects. Another recommendation is greater use of non-specialists. There is a huge mental health gap in low and middle income countries where the number of practitioners is not commensurate with the need for mental health support. What our study suggests is that in a small way, global challenges researchers can make mental health impact and can do so without overstretching expertise or needing a lot of resources. And one way we've evidenced that is to show quite a high proportion of these projects already, we think, make mental health impact, but it's not reported. And third is that we need to mobilise the voices of those who suffer from mental health conditions. And what we know from the Global Challenges Research Fund and Global Challenges Research overall is the need to work in a participatory and a collaborative way with communities across the world. And we know that making a social impact is something which the Global Challenges Research Fund projects are really well suited to and are actually making that kind of an impact already. In conclusion, we want to take forward this work by providing global challenge researchers with the guidance and resources to embed mental health impact in their work.